Hello and welcome to Under the Super Scope, where we take a look at some of the most famous games of all time and try to work out if they still hold up today. And this week we're looking down the Visor, what's often considered not only the best game on the GameCube, but also one of the very best games this medium has to offer. Wave Race Blues Metroid Prime! Up until Samus Returns, it might have felt rough to be a Metroid fan, but it's kind of always been this way. Super Metroid may have captured the hearts and money of many of us, but while Mario, Link and Donkey Kong all went 3D on the N64, the Galactic Bounty Hunter was nowhere to be seen. Between 1994 and 2002, not a single Metroid game saw the light of day. This made it all the more special when not only did we get the continuation of the core series, but also one of the most ambitious jumps any franchise has made into 3D, both on the same day. Metroid Prime has since been heralded as one of the most atmospheric games to ever hit the scene, but is it deserving of that pedigree? After all, something must have made it special for the bold and new to stand above the tried and true. First up for this analysis, we played through Metroid Prime using the Trilogy compilation on Wii. This utilises the same IR aiming found in Metroid Prime 3, and I personally find it to be the ideal way to play through both Prime 2 and Prime 1. The GameCube controls are built solely around a single stick in a similar way to GoldenEye, and while this has the perks of quickly changing between beams and visors, I find pointing simply far more comfortable myself. It's all a matter of preference, and those used to a modern dual stick setup will likely lean this way too. To boil it down to a basic description, the Metroid series is one where you explore alien planets in large, non-linear environments. You'll find areas and paths you can't quite reach until you obtain the correct item, so as Samus grows, the world does too. This constant loop of progression produces such a gratifying feeling, and with the simplicity of a single dimension, navigation is as straightforward as going left, right, downwards and upwards. The game puts this to great use immediately in both Metroid and Super Metroid, where if you try running to the right as you would in most games, you're met with some kind of roadblock. Instead, you're encouraged to do the unthinkable: go left in a side-scroller. With just these 4 directions though, Super Metroid is able to convey such a strong sense of isolation and dread. So how do you even begin to make a world where you can go in 360 directions? Well, look no further than Metroid Prime. While the prior games certainly built convincing worlds, many elements weren't exactly grounded in realism. How many long, vertical rooms can you count with random floating platforms in the original Metroid? Now how many can you count in Prime? To be remotely approachable, every single room in Metroid Prime needs to be visually distinct and contextually make sense. Retro Studios crafted a real world in Prime, not just a bunch of video game rooms. I mean, look no further than the platforms. This is actually something Retro Studios excel at. In Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze and Returns, every single platform is stitched into the environment, and this process of world building started with their very first Nintendo game, Metroid Prime. With its alien setting, Metroid's able to take certain liberties, but with Talon 4 being such a varied world, these liberties only apply to certain locales. In the Chozo Ruins, there is a rule that nothing floats. Platforms are tethered together with ropes and chains, or they're made up of crumbled remains of what were once thriving structures. The Magma Caverns take on natural formations with barely standing platforms suspended in pools of lava. That is until you get further into the caverns and towards the entrance to Phendrana Drifts. Suddenly we start seeing the operations of the Space Pirates, and a large man-made structure houses an elevator between the 2 locations. Space pirate activity is all over Phendrana Drifts, even if it may not seem to be at first. The platforms here are far more technically advanced, and they may seem to be floating, but there's actually thrusters just below them propelling them upwards. Platforms only mystically float in one lone location, and that's the stairwell leading to Metroid Prime. And if there's anywhere not to question floating platforms, it's the lead up to the strongest enemy force on the planet. A huge part of the atmosphere of Metroid Prime can be attributed to its strong sense of context. Everything in this world makes sense, and chances are if you ever wonder what something is, you can find out by scanning it. Samus' scanner serves multiple purposes, but more than anything, it lets you truly connect with your surroundings. You can read every monitor in the game and figure out what the space pirates are experimenting on. You can scan any enemy and find out exactly what they are and what they're weak to. And you can scan just about any object and find out why it's there and what it does. So those moments in the 2D games where you're not exactly sure what part of the floor you can bomb or what part of the wall you can blow up are not present in Metroid Prime. All you need to do is flip on your scanner and see the weaknesses for yourself. There aren't tutorial prompts saying, if you shoot this enemy from the back, it'll die, simply because, again, you can scan for yourself. The game doesn't need a cutscene with Samus monologuing about the space pirates experimenting with Phazon, because once again you can scan the environment and find out yourself. When there's such a hands-off approach to world building, storytelling and mechanical teachings, the sense of immersion and mastery grows exponentially. And in truth, Metroid Prime isn't even that hands-off. All the tropes are still here, only you're the one executing them. The pure ambition of taking Metroid and rethinking it in 3D space was not only special at the time, but is still incredibly special now. We see hundreds of games trying to capture the excellence of Super Metroid, but replicating it in 3D is not only a massive task, but it's one that only a few games seem to even attempt. Outside of the Metroid Prime trilogy, and that game we don't talk about, the Batman Arkham games and the Soul series are some of the only 3D Metroid-like games that come to mind. Now that's obviously not because Prime is unsuccessful, it just speaks to how difficult it is to make a 3D Metroid game, and Retro Studios nailed it on their first try. The sequels may have provided interesting takes and twists, but in terms of pure consistency and intelligence, it's hard to beat the first Metroid Prime. When looking at how to translate this complex labyrinth design into another dimension, it's clear Retro Studios examined Super Metroid in particular rather closely. See, the original Metroid just throws you into the world and says, go. And that's fine for how simple the game is, but Super Metroid and Prime both have completely separate starting areas, solely intended for the player to find their bearings. Neither of these areas have diverging paths, and so the exploration part of Metroid is temporarily put on hold. These two areas have so many similarities though. Both of these are brief areas that teach movement, platforming, combat, tell subtle story elements, and then climax with a self-destruct sequence that encourages you to get a grip of all those elements under pressure. It's the same template, but Prime of course has its own twists. Immediately after the greatest first-person transition in gaming, we're taught how to shoot as you may expect, but then immediately following that comes a brand new element, the scan visor, and you have this right from the get-go. Scanning is such a huge part of Prime, and throughout this short opening area, you'll be forced to use it on a variety of doors and panels, with the hope that you extrapolate that task and use it on just about everything else. Another technique Prime incorporates is what I like to call the late game test drive. Samus starts off with a variety of abilities such as the Morph Ball, which allows the players of previous Metroid games to feel a sense of familiarity, and also gives new players a preview of how strong you'll get down the line. Samus of course loses all these powers right at the end of the segment, and so when you finally crash on Talon 4, you're motivated to get back to the state you were in. You're given a taste of the power you can wield, and to be stripped away to this vulnerable state makes the sense of isolation and motivation even stronger. Retrieving your abilities is actually more rapid than you may think, and it soon gets to the point where Samus's gear is more impressive than the opening, and so not only are you trying to get back to the familiar, but you're trying to see how far you can go. The first-person perspective changes everything, and much like Ocarina of Time, items and movement had to be restructured to work in this viewpoint. In fact, just like Ocarina, the perspective changes from first-person to third-person when you enter the Morph Ball. Such an iconic attribute of Samus can't go amiss, and in 3D, I actually feel like the Morph Ball was more organic than ever. When in 2D, Morph Ball tunnels are either impossible to miss or incredibly vague, whereas in 3D, you have areas like this where it literally feels like you're squeezing through parts of the environment. It's not often you see Samus in the third person, but these transitional glimpses help keep the character of Samus intact. Her reactions when she initially lands on Talon 4 conveys what are likely the same thoughts of the player. Where am I and where do I go? Samus is human, and this is something the series often goes out of its way to remind you of, but I think Prime finds the greatest balance. Throughout most of the game, you are Samus looking down the visor through her own eyes. And usually, in the midst of a firefight or in areas with explosives, you'll catch the reflection of a woman. As robotic and aggressive as Samus is, the game will always nudge you to remember that there's a human behind the mask. This is so much more effective than having Samus take her suit off at the end of the game. In fact, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate pulls off a similar trick in the Ridley trailer, where this brief look through Samus's visor shows her breathing in. This one intake of breath sums up her relationship with Ridley better than any other instance of Metroid storytelling, and it feels completely influenced by Metroid Prime's approach. Of course, it's a game about showing rather than telling, and these flashes are so powerful in reinforcing that. First-person characters are usually blank slates, but with just an arm cannon, Samus has just about as much character as she does in 2D. We get a longer look at Samus when she's riding in the elevators, where we again see a somewhat lost character taking in her surroundings. And what's interesting is this is actually a load screen. In Metroid Prime, you never leave the world, and this is 100% a game about maintaining atmosphere. And to cut away to a blank screen and shout, "Now loading," will completely demolish that. Instead, what happens is this, and sometimes the doors won't open straight away. When developing Metroid Prime, Miyamoto suggested to the team, what if Samus had a bug head? And by this, he was referring to the ability of swapping out how Samus can perceive her surroundings. In addition to scanning, there's also a thermal visor and an X-ray visor, and what I love about these two is it's very rare that the game requires you to use them, and so when you feel you need to seek the benefits, that's when it's time to flip your visor. As soon as you get the thermal visor, the lights dim and now you're in pitch darkness. This of course incentivizes you to use the new Visor to navigate in the darkness. Outside of this building though, there aren't very many other areas like this. And that's why this room here in the Phazon Mines rewards your mastery of Samus's mechanics. You almost instinctively swap over to the thermal visor, despite this rarely being something that's reinforced. In fact, in the late game, you're juggling so many different moves, the morph ball, the grapple, the different beams, the different visors. But because of their gradual build-up and constant iterative nature, it never feels overbearing. After all, no matter what power you're using, every action requires you to move and point. That's all there is to Metroid Prime, but the intelligent mechanics make such clever use of this. Even platforming works in first person, which is something very few other games have even tried. Now, I am not a fan of double jumps, and I'm sure we'll get into that more in the future, but Metroid Prime is one of the very few exceptions. First up, the second jump is a key to progression, much like any other item. More importantly though, you can actually judge your depth without seeing your character model, which is a very tricky thing to do. There are later segments with lots of verticality, and this would be hell to navigate with the default jump. I think there's a reason we've never seen this power up in 2D though, and that's purely to do with perspective. Sure, there's the space jump, which Prime 3 also has, but the properties aren't quite the same as a double jump. Before the game launched, there was a lot of doubt to whether Metroid could successfully transition to first person, and looking back, it's more of a question of why wouldn't it? Retro nailed every aspect of the perspective, and while we saw certain elements cut from the 2D games like being able to sprint, they were worthy reductions. For a game about immersion, nothing is more immersive than being in the eyes of the character. What about the other aspects of the 3D jump though? Well, a lot actually changed in this approach. Levels couldn't just consist of vertical hallways with doors on each side anymore. We end up with something a little more linear in how it's constructed, but with the same non-linear progression. So rooms in Metroid Prime don't branch out quite to the same extent as they do in 2D games. And so what we often get instead are small hubs, large rooms that house different segments of a world. However, when you're on a path, it's uncommon for them to split in different directions too. Usually rooms will just lead into one another, and if they split out, they often hit a dead end. This has its pros and cons. The pro? You can actually navigate without wanting to rip your hair out. If they designed a 3D game just like the 2D ones, it would be so overwhelming. You have a really intelligent map too, which again has been reworked in 3D. You can rotate it around to get a better sense of verticality, or just work out exactly where rooms are in relation to you. The game will even nudge you in the right direction if you don't make any progress for a while, which is my favourite take on waypoints. Prime 3 got a bit more direct with this, and I don't really appreciate it. But what about the cons? Well, the more linear areas are a slog for backtracking. I'm talking areas like the Space Pirate Research Center in Phendrana Drifts, and most tedious of all, the Phazon Mines. Your initial run through both of these segments don't encourage a great deal of backtracking, but it's the end of the game where it becomes a real issue. I think 90% of Metroid Prime is near flawless, and if it weren't for the Chozo artifacts, we would have something on the caliber of A Link to the Past and Resident Evil 4. So let's look at these as if it were your first playthrough. You've gone through all the continents, got all the power-ups, and now you're being pointed in the way of what's seemingly the final area. So you make your way over there, only to find 12 pillars standing in your way, all offering hints. Quite similar to Wind Waker's Triforce quest, Metroid Prime prevents you from entering the final boss until you explore every part of the world again and track down 12 artifacts. It's nowhere near as long and tedious though. Some are easy, and you may have even found a few over the course of your adventure, but a ton require backtracking to areas and using items you didn't have while you were there the first time. In themselves, the artifacts weren't a bad idea. It kinda gives you this feeling of mastery when you're given a hint and immediately know where to go. It's the navigation of it all that gets frustrating though. For instance, one artifact is in the Talon overworld. Only problem? It's in a segment that requires you to dip in and out of other areas to get to. This is despite there being an easily accessible portion just below it, however trying to jump up leaves you just out of reach. So instead of simply running over to it, you have to jump through a ton of hoops, and this is true for a lot of the artifacts. It gets to the point where it's not a fun scavenger quest, but just feels like padding. If they made it so that you only need like 8 artifacts out of 12, it might have been a lot less tedious, but as it is, the artifacts are an annoying gate that stop you from finishing the game. It completely demolishes the momentum and the pacing suffers severely. If these were a side quest of sorts, I think I might actually like them, but on a first and repeat playthrough, they're just tedious to me. Areas in the late game aren't exactly friendly to explore either. Chozo ghosts now appear all over the Chozo ruins, and this gets old pretty fast. The first time seeing them, it's an indicator that you're going the right way. I mean, after all, Metroid Prime populates areas with new enemies all the time. Magma Caverns gets space pirates, the Phazon Mines gets Metroids, and the Chozo ruins gets Chozo ghosts. The ghosts just take a long time to defeat, they dull the area, and they have very loud music. Despite not ending on a high note, the journey and sheer effort behind Metroid Prime is something that can't be undermined, and the lack of games like it is evidence of this. There are elements of Metroid that work better in 2D, and likewise some elements work better in 3D. But despite the endgame bump, Retro Studios got this right on their first try. And while I appreciate the sequels and how they interpret these mechanics, I don't think they come close to the sheer amazement of Metroid Prime. Though each sequel does keep the scavenger hunt, which is something I can do without in Metroid Prime 4. All in all, the art still holds up 16 years later. The music is sometimes soft, sometimes erratic, but always mesmerizing, and every single element is dripping in context from both a story and visual perspective. Games like Metroid Prime just don't come along very often, and if Prime 4 is even a slither as good as this, we're in for one wild ride. But how can we talk about Metroid Prime without mentioning Prime Pinball, baby? Now, Prime reimagined Metroid in a 3D world, but Prime Pinball reimagines that reimagining as a pinball table. I mean, just wow. So what do you guys think of Prime Pinball, and I guess Metroid Prime? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to GameXplain for more from Under the Super Scope and everything else gaming too. Until next time, bye!